Hello, dear learners. I am Dr. Pittiholila Raskha. Once again, welcome you to this session. Today, we shall discuss interpreting post-colonial sites. It's a part of our Module 11, that is colonial and post-colonial heritage. Post-colonial sites are places shaped by the histories and legacies of colonial rule. These include forts, administrative buildings, plantations, railways, prisons, memorials, cemeteries, mission schools, and urban spaces constructed or transformed during the colonial regime. In countries like India, post-colonial sites represent layered histories, indigenous past, colonial intervention, anti-colonial resistance, and post-independence interpretations. Interpreting post-colonial sites involve more than describing architecture or historical facts. It requires critical engagement with issues of power, memory, identity, representation, resistance, nationalism, trauma, and decolonization. These sites often embody both oppression and modernity, exploitation and transformation, domination and resistance. Therefore, interpretation must be sensitive, inclusive, and reflexive. After completing this unit, we will be able to define post-colonial heritage and identify different types of post-colonial sites. Understand key theoretical frameworks in post-colonial studies, analyze how colonial histories are represented and contested, examine their politics of memory, and identify in heritage interpretations. Also, you will evaluate ethical challenges in presenting colonial and traumatic past. Propose inclusive and decolonialized interpretations strategies. Now we shall move to the conceptual framework of interpreting colonial sites. Understanding post-colonial sites requires a strong conceptual foundation. The interpretation of such sites is not limited to historical descriptions. It involves engaging with questions of power, representation, identity, memory, and cultural transformation. The conceptual framework therefore combines heritage studies with post-colonial theory, subaltern perspectives, and decolonization approaches. What is post-colonial heritage? First of all, we shall discuss this issue. Post-colonial heritage refers to the material and symbolic legacies of colonial rule that continue to shape societies after independence. It includes not only structures built during the colonial rule, but also the social, economic, cultural, and political systems that evolved through colonial encounters. Post-colonial heritage is complex because it reflects both dimension and transformation. It embodies histories of oppression, exploitation, resistance, adoption, and hybridity. Now we shall discuss the tangible dimension of post-colonial heritage. We have already discussed what is tangible and what is intangible heritage. So I don't think I should also recall what is tangible. Okay, the physical structures created during colonial rule is called tangible dimension of post-colonial heritage. These include government buildings, courts and secretaries, residences of colonial officials, churches and mission schools, military forts and cantonments, railway stations and ports. Such architecture often symbolize imperial power and authority. Grand designs, neoclassical styles, and urban planning layouts were used to assert dominance and control. In post-colonial contexts, these buildings may be repurposed as museums, educational institutions, or government offices, creating layered meanings. First, the landscapes shaped by colonial economic system. Colonialism reorganized land and labor to serve imperial economic interests. These transformed landscapes include tea, coffee, indigo, and rubber plantations, mining zones, canal system and irrigation projects, railway networks linking forts to resource areas. These landscapes are not neutral. They represent systems of extractions, labor migrations, environmental changes, and social reconstructing. Plantation sites, for instance, reflect histories of bound labor and displacement. Then sites of resistance and repression. Post-colonial heritage also includes spaces associated with struggles and resistance. Battlefields of anti-colonial wars, prisons such as cellular jail, sites of massacre, for example, Jallianwala tragedy, execution ground, then protest sites and public squares. These sites often became national memorials. Their interpretation may emphasize sacrifices, patriotism, and collective memory, contributing to the nation building system. Then, memorial and museums interpreting colonial histories. Museums, archives, and memorial complexes reinterpret colonial histories into present. They mediate between historical documentation, national narratives, public memory, tourism representations. The way these institutions frame colonialism, whether as exploitation, modernization, resistance, or shared heritage, shapes public understandings. Then, intangible dimensions of post-colonial heritage, which we cannot touch. Okay, post-colonial heritage is not limited to physical dimensions or physical remains. It also includes intangible legacies that continue to influence everyday life. Freedom struggle narratives, stories of resistance leaders, revolutionary movement, and independence struggles form a major component of national identity. These narratives are preserved through textbooks, memorial speeches, songs, and commemorative events. Then, oral histories, local memories of colonial rule, stories of land losses, labor exploitation, or missionary encounters offer alternative perspectives to official archives. Oral histories provide emotional depth and community-based knowledge often absent in colonial documentation. Then, cultural hybridity. Colonial encounters created cultural hybridity forms such as Indo-Saracenic architecture, Anglo-Indian cuisine, mixed linguistic forms, hybrid dress, and social practices. Homi Bhabha's concept of hybridity explains how colonialized societies did not merely imitate colonial culture but transformed it, creating new identities in a third space between colonizer and colonist. Then, language and administrative system. Colonial language, legal frameworks, education system, and bureaucratic models often remain influential after independence. For example, today itself also, English as a global and administrative language we are adopting. Common law system, civil service structures, these institutional continues form part of post-colonial heritage even though they are not physical monuments. Now moving to the theoretical foundations. To interpret post-colonial heritage critically, scholars rely on theoretical frameworks developed in post-colonial studies and heritage discourse. First of all, we shall discuss the post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory examines how colonialism shaped systems of knowledge, identity, and representation. It critiques the way colonial powers constructed images of colonialized societies to justify domination. Edward Said, who proposed the Orientalism, said argued that the West constructed the Orient as exotic, backward, irrational, and inferior. These representations were not neutral. They supported colonial control. In heritage interpretation, Orientalist perspective may romanticize colonial culture, portray colonial rule as civilizing or modernizing, ignore indigenous agency. Understanding Orientalism helps interpreters identify bias in museum displays, guide narratives, and tourism promotions. Then Homi Bhabha, that is the hybridity and third space. Bhabha introduced the idea of hybridity, suggesting that colonial encounters produce mixed identities rather than pure cultural domination. The third space is a space of negotiations where colonialized subjects adapt and resist. Cultural meanings are reinterpreted. Identity became fluid rather than fixed. In post-colonial sites, hybridity may appear in architecture, language, and ritual practices. Then Gayatri Chakraborty, that is the subaltern voice, she speaks. Can the subaltern speak? She highlighted how marginalized groups, that is, women, peasants, tribal communities, were often silenced in both colonial and nationalist narratives. Her work encourages interpreters to question whose voices are included, recognize the structural silencing, seek inclusive storytelling. Then we shall discuss the subaltern studies. Subaltern studies is a critical historiographical approach that seeks to recover and foreground the voices of marginalized communities who were excluded from elite and colonial narratives of history. Emerging in the 1980s under the leadership of historians such as Ranajit Guha, the subaltern studies collective challenge traditional histories that focus primarily on colonial administrators, nationalist leaders, and dominant social groups. Instead, it emphasized the agencies of peasants, tribal communities, workers, women, and other subordinated groups, collectively termed as subaltern. Drawing inspiration from the idea of Antonio Gramsci, the approach examines how power, resistance, and consciousness operate outside elite political structures. By analyzing folk traditions, oral histories, local archives, and everyday acts of resistance, subaltern studies reinterprets colonial and post-colonial histories from below, highlighting that marginalized communities were not merely passive victims, but active participants in shaping historical changes. Subaltern studies challenge elite narratives in examining peasant uprisings, tribal resistance, labor movements, everyday forms of resistance. In heritage interpretations, this approach demands attention to plantation workers' experiences, prisoners' stories, women's participations in resistance, indigenous knowledge systems, etc. Rather than glorifying elite nationalist leaders alone, interpretation becomes more socially inclusive. Then decolonization of heritage. Decolonization involves critically reassessing colonial legacies and transforming how they are presented and understood. It does not necessarily mean destroying colonial monuments. Instead, it seeks to reinterpret colonial monuments, provide historical context, acknowledge exploitation and inequality, avoid uncritical celebration of the empire. Then challenge Eurocentric narratives. Move beyond colonial archives as the only source of truth, recognizing indigenous epistemologies and perspectives, include indigenous and local perspective, then consult descendant communities, incorporate oral histories and community memory, then question the glorification of the empire, avoid presenting colonialism solely as a civilizing mission, address violence, extraction, and racial hierarchies. Decolonization also involves institutional reform in museums, archives, and educational systems. Now we shall move to the types of post-colonial sites. Post-colonial sites are layered spaces where architecture, memory, power, labor, and identity interest. They are not neutral remnant of the past. Rather, they are politically charged landscapes shaped by colonial authority and later reinterpreted in independent nations. These sites range from monumental state buildings and prisons to plantations and missionary institutions. Each category embodies conflicting narratives of domination and resistance, oppressions and adoption, exploitation and transformations, etc. Interpreting them requires moving beyond celebration or condemnation toward historically grounded critical engagement. Interpreting them requires moving beyond celebration or coordination towards historically grounded critical engagement. First of all, colonial administrative architecture. Colonial administrative architecture was designed to project authority, stability, and imperial legitimacy. These buildings were visual instruments of power, communicating the presence of colonial rule through scale, symmetry, and grandeur. Examples are Writers' Building, which was constructed in 1777 for the clerks, that is, the writers of the East India Company. It later became the Secretariat of Bengal. Its imposing facade symbolized bureaucratic control and the institutionalization of colonial governance. Then Victoria Memorial. It was constructed between 1906 and 1921 in white Makram marble. It commemorates Queen Victoria and exemplifies Indo-Saracenic grandeur, blending Mughal, Venetian, and British architectural motifs. Secretariat buildings in former presidencies such as Madras and Bombay are also comes under this category. Colonial administrative buildings often featured neoclassical, Gothic revival, or Indo-Saracenic styles, grand columns, domes, and symmetrical layouts. Elevated locations overlooking indigenous settlements, spacious compounds separating rulers from the ruled, urban planning reinforced hierarchy. European quarters were distinct from native areas, reflecting racial and societal segregation. Should these structures be presented as architectural achievement and urban heritage landmarks, or symbols of imperial dominance and racial hierarchy? Modern heritage interpretation must balance aesthetic appreciation and historical critique. For example, highlighting architectural style without discussing colonial governance risks romanticizing the empire. Focusing solely on operation may overlook architectural hybridity and adoption. Sites of incarnation and resistance. These sites are deeply emotive spaces associated with repression, sacrifice, and anti-colonial struggles. They represent both colonial violence and nationalist resilience. For example, Cellular Jail, which was built by the British to isolate political prisoners. It became a symbol of suffering and sacrifice during the freedom struggle. Then Jallianwala Bagh, site of 1919 massacre, where British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians. Then Sabarmati Ashram, associated with Mahatma Gandhi and the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements. Interpretation of these sites focus on nationalist resistance. These sites often became sacred spaces of patriotism. Narratives focus on heroism, sacrifice, and moral courage. Then martyrdom, memorialization highlights individuals who endure imprisonment or death for independence. Trauma and memory. Such sites evoke grief and collective memory. Interpretation must be sensitive to emotional impact. These sites are crucial in nation building but should also encourage critical reflection on violence, state power, and memory politics. Plantation and labor sites. Plantation landscapes represent economic exploitation and social reconstructing under colonial capitalism. Unlike monumental buildings, these sites are often dispersed rural spaces. For example, tea plantation in Assam, indigo plantation in Bihar, and rubber plantation in Kerala. Colonial plantation introduced monoculture farming for global markets. Indigenous land was appropriated, forests cleared, and labor recruited under exploitative contexts. Plantations functional as enclosed economic enclaves, hierarchical labor system, sites of surveillance and control. Workers often lived in segregated quarters with limited rights or with no rights. Now here interpretation issues are forced labor. Many plantation workers were recruited to cohesion and exploited contexts. Then economic exploitation. Profits were exported to imperial centers while labor communities remained impoverished. Migrated labor histories. Plantation labor reshaped demographic patterns, creating diasporic identities. Then environmental transformation. Due to plantation system, the deforestation was welcomed, soil depletion, loss of biodiversity, and altered river systems. Today, plantation regions may be promoted as ecotourism or heritage tourism destinations. However, interpretations should include labor struggles and trade union movements, women's labor contributions, long-term socio-economic inequalities, ecological consequences, etc. Such landscapes should be read as living heritage shaped by economic cohesion and resilience. Then the missionary and educational institution. Colonial missions and schools played a major role in reshaping cultural and intellectual landscapes. These include mission schools and colleges, churches and seminaries, printing presses, hospitals, etc. These missionary institutions introduce Western style education, English language instructions, Christian religious practices, and new literary and scientific curricula. They contributed to the rise of educated middle class and reform movements. These institutions can be interpreted in two contrasting ways. Firstly, as modernizing tools. Spread literacy, introduced print culture, promoted social reforms, opened educational access to marginalized communities. Again, these can also be treated as instruments of cultural dominance by undermining indigenous knowledge system, encourage cultural assimilation, disrupt traditional belief systems, promoted Eurocentric worldviews. A balanced interpretations acknowledges both empowerment and cultural transformations. Now, we are going to conclude this session. Interpreting post-colonial society is not a neutral or purely academic exercise. It is deeply dynamic and political process. These sites are living landscapes of memory where power, resistance, trauma, and transformations intersect. They are not simply architectural remnants or preserved monuments of a bygone area. Rather, they function as an active arena in which societies revisit, reassess, and renegotiate their understanding of history and identity. Post-colonial sites carry layered meanings. A former administrative building may simultaneously represent architectural achievement, imperial authority, nationalist resistance, and contemporary civic use. A prison battlefield or memorial may evoke pain and sacrifice for some, pride and patriotism for others, and complex ambivalence for younger generations. Because of these multiple and sometimes conflicting interpretations, heritage professionals must recognize that historical narratives are not fixed. They evolve with changing political climates, academic debates, and community perspectives. Responsible interpretations demand more than factual accuracy. It requires ethical awareness. Colonial histories often involve exploitation, cultural suppression, racial hierarchies, and economic extractions. Ignoring these realities in favor of aesthetic admiration or simplified narrative risks perpetuating historical injustice. At the same time, interpretation must avoid reducing colonial encounters to a single story of victimhood or heroism. A mature approach critically engages with complexity, acknowledging oppression, while also examining adoption, hybridity, resistance movement, and the emergence of new identities. Decolonialized interpretations moves beyond dominant imperial perspectives. It creates local voices, subaltern experiences, and descendant communities. It questions whose stories have traditionally been told and whose have been silenced. By incorporating oral histories, indigenous knowledge systems, and community memory, interpretations became more inclusive and representative. This participatory approach transformed heritage forms a top-down narrative into a shared dialogue. Moreover, ethical heritage practices promotes reflection rather than passive consumption. Post-colonial sites should encourage visitors to think critically about the legacies of the empire in contemporary social, economic, and political structures. They can become spaces for dialogue about inequality, cultural diversity, recolonization, and social justice. In this sense, interpretation serves not only to explain the past but also to inform responsible citizenship in the present. Ultimately, interpreting post-colonial sites is about balancing remembrance with responsibility. It requires sensitivity to trauma, oppresses to multiple perspectives, and a commitment to historical integrity. When approached thoughtfully, these sites became powerful platforms for learning, healing, and intercultural understanding, bridging past and present while contributing to a more inclusive and ethical conscious future. Thank you very much for becoming a partner of this learning process. Thank you.